In 1970, a single pound of ground beef could decide how long a family stayed full. In small American kitchens with rattling pots and tired paychecks, mothers turned almost nothing into meals that fed 10 people without complaints. Inflation was rising, grocery prices kept climbing, and families from Ohio to Texas learned how to stretch every ingredient with precision. These weren't fancy recipes or cookbook inventions. They were real meals made from discipline, instinct, and experience. Food that filled the table, carried through hard weeks, and somehow tasted richer than it should have. They didn't have extra money. They simply knew how to make 1 pound feel like enough for everyone. Number 25, American Chop Suey. They called it different things depending on where you lived. Goulash in the Midwest, slumgullion in parts of Appalachia. In New England, they called it American Chop Suey and didn't apologize for a single thing about it. Ground beef, elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, onion. That was it. 1 pound of beef disappeared into a pound of pasta and came back as something larger than either one alone. Nothing wasted, nothing left in the pan. Number 24, hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. Half a pound of beef, browned hard, then pulled back with flour and water and a long pour of whole milk if you had it, broth if you didn't. The gravy doubled the meat, tripled it if your roux was right. Ladled hot over a mountain of mashed potatoes and set on the table without ceremony. In the coal country of West Virginia, this was a weeknight standard. The potatoes cost almost nothing. The flour cost almost nothing. The half-pound of beef became a meal for 8. Number 23, stuffed cabbage rolls. Halupki in Pennsylvania. Galabki in Chicago's Polish neighborhoods. Holubtsi in the Ukrainian communities of western Ohio. Different names, same mathematics. 1 pound of beef mixed with a full cup of raw rice. The rice swelled inside the roll during cooking and doubled the filling. Each roll fed one person. You made 12 rolls from what should have made 6. A head of cabbage cost 9 cents in 1973. The whole pot cost under $2 and fed a family for 2 nights. Number 22, picadillo. In the Cuban neighborhoods of Miami and the Mexican-American kitchens of San Antonio, picadillo was the weekly anchor meal. Ground beef cooked down with tomatoes, onion, garlic, a handful of green olives, a few raisins, diced potato. The potatoes absorbed the fat. The olives brought brine. The raisins brought something sweet and dark that cut through everything else. It cost almost nothing. Today, restaurants in Miami's Brickell neighborhood serve it as heritage cuisine for $18 a plate. Grandma just called it Tuesday dinner. Number 21, shepherd's pie. Leftover mashed potatoes on top. Whatever ground beef and vegetables were left from earlier in the week pressed into the bottom of a cast iron pan. Into the oven until the potato crust went gold at the edges and the filling bubbled up through the cracks. Nothing new was purchased. Nothing was thrown away. The refrigerator was emptied, not restocked. Today it appears on gastro menus in Boston and Portland under the name cottage pie at $22. The recipe hasn't changed. The price has. Number 20, beef and bean chili. This was not the chili that wins competitions. This was not the chili that gets debated in Texas. This was the chili that fed 10 people on 1 pound of ground beef, and it did it with dried pinto beans soaked overnight and a can of tomatoes and whatever pepper and cumin lived in the cabinet above the stove. The beans tripled the volume. A pound of dried pintos cost 29 cents in 1972. Combined with 1 pound of ground beef at 89 cents, the whole pot, enough for 10, came in just over $1. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know about that pot of chili. In 1972, Tone Spices and several competing spice companies began a coordinated push to sell pre-mixed chili seasoning packets. The packets were marketed as convenience, as saving time. What they actually did was remove the cook's knowledge from the equation. When you bought the packet, you stopped learning what cumin does alone, what chili powder does alone, how heat changes each differently. You stopped being a cook. You became an assembler. That was the point. An assembler buys packets forever. A cook never needs to. The women who made chili from scratch in 1972 knew the smell of toasted cumin in dry pan before the beef went in. They knew how long to let the beans go before the beef joined them. They knew things about spice and heat and time that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 19. Scratch Sloppy Joes. Not from a can, not from a packet. Tomato paste, brown sugar, yellow mustard, Worcestershire sauce, white vinegar, diced onion, 1 pound of ground beef. Everything measured by instinct, adjusted by taste, finished when it looked right. Thick enough to mound on a bun without running off the sides. Manwich launched in 1969. Hunt's put it on store shelves and marketed it directly at working mothers with the tagline that implied making sloppy joes from scratch was a burden, that it took too long, that a can was the same thing. It was not the same thing. The scratch version had depth, the vinegar brightening the tomato, the brown sugar pulling it back, the Worcestershire underneath everything like a low note. The can had one flat flavor and high fructose corn syrup by 1975, but the marketing worked. By 1974, Manwich had significant national distribution, and Scratch Sloppy Joes had begun their slow disappearance from the weeknight rotation. The recipe didn't die because it was hard. It took 15 minutes. It died because a company spent money convincing a generation of mothers that 15 minutes was too long to give their families something real. She was right. Everything she knew was right. The woman standing at that stove with the tomato paste and the brown sugar, she was right about all of it. Number 18. Beef and rice casserole, 1 pound of ground beef. 1 cup of long-grain white rice, uncooked. A can of beef broth, sometimes homemade, sometimes the 10-cent can from the store shelf, diced onion. Salt, pepper, garlic powder if you had it. Everything layered into a baking dish, covered tight with foil, and put into a 350-degree oven for an hour. What happened inside that covered dish during that hour was a kind of quiet miracle. The rice absorbed every drop of the broth and every drop of the fat the beef released. When you pulled back the foil, there was no liquid left. There was no waste. There was a crust along the bottom edges that the children fought over, and a steam that came up and hit your face and smelled like something that had been cooking all day, even though it had only been an hour. In southern Ohio church basements and Indiana farmhouse kitchens, this was the dish that appeared at every potluck, every covered dish supper, every gathering where you needed to bring something that fed many from a little. 1 cup of rice in 1973 cost less than a dime. The whole casserole, feeding 8, came in under $1.50. Grandma just called it the rice dish. There was no other name needed. Everyone at the table knew exactly what it was before the foil came off. Number 17. Bierox. In the German-Russian communities that settled the Kansas and Nebraska plains in the late 1800s, bierox were not a recipe. They were a system. Yeasted dough rolled flat, filled with seasoned ground beef, shredded cabbage, and diced onion. Then pinched closed and baked until golden. Portable. Complete. A meal you could hold in one hand. 1 pound of beef stretched across a full batch, 12 to 15 rolls, because the cabbage and onion filled the interior. The dough was the vehicle. The filling was the point. And the filling went further because the cabbage gave it bulk, and the onion gave it sweetness, and the whole thing needed almost nothing else. The Runza restaurant chain formalized the recipe in Nebraska in 1949 and expanded through the 1970s. What they sold was a reasonable approximation. What the grandmothers in Hastings and Salina and Dodge City made at home was something the chain has never quite replicated. Because the home version used lard in the dough, and the cabbage was unsalted and pressed before it went in, and the women who made them knew by touch when the dough was right. That knowledge doesn't transfer to a commercial kitchen. It lives in hands. When the hands are gone, it's gone. Number 16. Dirty rice. The name comes from the color. Chicken livers and ground beef cooked down together with the Cajun Trinity. Onion, celery, green bell pepper, and folded into white rice until the rice turned the color of dark earth. Dirty. That was the word. That was the point. In the parishes of southern Louisiana, dirty rice was weekly food, not special occasion food, Tuesday food. The chicken livers cost almost nothing. They were the part of the bird nobody else wanted, which meant they were the part the working poor could afford. Combined with a small amount of ground beef for body and fat, they produced a dish of extraordinary depth for almost no money. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know about chicken livers. A 4-ounce serving contains more iron than a ribeye steak, more folate than most vegetables, more vitamin B12 than almost anything else you can eat. The women in Breaux Bridge and Lafayette and Opelousas who cooked dirty rice every week were providing their families a nutritional density that modern supplement companies now charge $20 a bottle to approximate. They knew things about organ meat and nutrition that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. They didn't call it superfoods. They called it making the rice go further. They were right about everything. Number 15. Beef vegetable soup. This is the recipe that the stone soup fable was actually about. You browned the beef first, just a pound, broken small, and then you built around it. Whatever the garden had, whatever the root cellar held. Carrots and potatoes in October, green beans and corn in August, canned tomatoes in February when the garden was a memory, a beef bone if you had one, barley if the budget allowed. Water, always more water, and time. The soup got better the longer it sat. Reheated the next day, it was richer than the day it was made. A pot started on Sunday fed a family of 8 through Tuesday without apology. In rural Missouri and eastern Tennessee and the farming communities of central Illinois, this was the soup that filled the house with a smell that started in the morning and was still there when you came home from school in the afternoon. You smelled it from the end of the driveway. You knew what it meant. It meant the work was already done. It meant someone had been thinking about dinner since 10 o'clock in the morning. That smell is a form of love that has no modern equivalent. Number 14. Tamale pie. Ground beef seasoned with chili powder, cumin, and onion, spread into the bottom of a cast-iron skillet, then covered with a thick pour of cornmeal batter, and baked until the top went firm and cracked at the edges, and the filling pushed up through in dark, fragrant bubbles. This was not a tamale. It was the idea of a tamale translated into something a working mother in El Paso or Tucson or the colonias outside San Antonio could make in 40 minutes on a Tuesday with what she had. The cornmeal crust was the extender. 1 pound of beef under that crust fed 10 people because the cornmeal was filling and the beef flavored every bite without needing to be in every bite. You tasted it everywhere. You found a piece of it maybe every third forkful. That was enough. Today in Austin and Phoenix and Los Angeles, deconstructed tamale bowls appear on fast casual menus at $16 a serving with a note about traditional Mexican-American inspiration. The inspiration is a working mother's Tuesday dinner. They forgot to mention that part. Number 13. Poor man's stroganoff. The real stroganoff, the one with sour cream and beef tenderloin that appeared in Russian aristocratic cooking in the 19th century, never entered the kitchens we're talking about. What entered those kitchens was an adaptation so thorough it became its own thing entirely. Ground beef, egg noodles, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with a ½ cup of milk, onion powder, a spoonful of Worcestershire, that was it. The soup replaced the sour cream. The ground beef replaced the tenderloin. The whole dish took 20 minutes and cost under $1 and tasted, this is important, genuinely good. Not like a compromise, like a meal that knew what it was. But here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know about that can of cream of mushroom soup. Campbell's Soup Company, through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, ran a deliberate and well-documented campaign to position their condensed soups not as convenience food, but as cooking ingredients. They placed recipes on the labels. They distributed recipe booklets. They worked with home economics programs in schools, some funded directly by Campbell's, to teach young women that canned soup was a legitimate building block of scratch cooking. It was a slow erasure, not of the recipe itself, but of the knowledge underneath the recipe. The woman who knew how to make a bechamel didn't need the can. Campbell's needed her to forget the bechamel. Within one generation, the can became the default. The roux became the exotic option. That is not progress. That is the replacement of a skill with a product, and the product company profits every time the skill is not passed down. Number 12. Beef and cabbage skillet. 1 pound of ground beef. Half a head of green cabbage, chopped rough. 1 onion, diced. Salt and pepper and a splash of apple cider vinegar at the end. That was the whole recipe. The beef went in first, browned hard in its own fat, then the onion until it softened. Then the cabbage, and here was the moment. The cabbage went in and looked like too much, like it would never fit, like the pan wasn't big enough, and then the heat took it. Within 10 minutes it had wilted down to almost nothing, soaked up every drop of beef fat in the pan, taken on a color at the edges that was almost caramel, and become something that bore almost no resemblance to raw cabbage. A head of green cabbage in 1973 cost 9 cents. The entire skillet, feeding 6 to 8 people, cost under $1.20. A 2019 nutritional analysis published in the British Journal of Nutrition found that the combination of cruciferous vegetables cooked in animal fat increases the bioavailability of fat-soluble vitamins in both ingredients, meaning the cabbage cooked in beef fat was more nutritious than either one alone. Grandma didn't know the biochemistry. She just knew it tasted right, and everyone cleaned their plate. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 11. Cornbread hamburger casserole. The beef went in the bottom of the pan first, seasoned with onion, diced green pepper, canned tomatoes, salt and chili powder if the family liked heat. Then the cornbread batter, just cornmeal, egg, buttermilk, and a pinch of baking soda, poured directly over the top of the hot beef mixture and slid into the oven. What happened in that oven was the reason this dish existed. The cornbread didn't just cook on top. The bottom inch of it absorbed the beef juices and the tomato liquid and cooked through dense and savory and almost custardy. The top inch went golden and light and cracked. You got 2 textures in every square you cut, the golden crust above, the dark beef-soaked bottom below. In Deep South kitchens from Georgia to East Texas, this was the dish that appeared when the family was large and the week had been long. 1 pound of beef under that cornbread fed 10 people without anyone walking away hungry. Cornmeal cost 3 cents per cup in 1972. The whole pan cost under $1.50. Grandma just called it hamburger cornbread. No other explanation was required. Number 10. Beef and noodle bake. White egg noodles cooked just short of done. Ground beef browned with onion. Beef broth, sometimes canned, sometimes from a bone simmered that morning. Everything combined in a deep baking dish, the broth just covering the noodles, covered with foil and baked until the noodles absorbed every drop. This was the dish that General Mills looked at when they launched Hamburger Helper in 1971. They looked at it, they studied it, and they decided that the goal was not to improve it, but to replace the knowledge required to make it. The boxed version included pre-measured noodles and a flavor packet, and instructions simple enough that no culinary instinct was required. You stopped learning. You started following. The scratch version required you to know how much broth the noodles needed. You learned by doing it wrong once and then right. That learning lived in you forever. The box gave you dinner, but took away the education. By 1975, Hamburger Helper controlled enough of the market that the scratch noodle bake had begun to disappear from the weeknight table in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, the exact states where it had been most common. In Ohio farmhouse kitchens in the 1960s, this dish had fed families of 8 for under $1. By 1976, the boxed version cost more and fed fewer. Nobody noticed because the advertising told them they were saving time. Number 9. Oatmeal meatloaf, not breadcrumbs. Oats. 1 pound of ground beef, 1 full cup of rolled oats. 1 egg, diced onion, a pour of whole milk, salt, pepper, a stripe of ketchup across the top that caramelized in the oven into something darker and more complex than ketchup had any right to be. The oats were not a lesser substitute for breadcrumbs. They were better. They absorbed moisture during cooking and released it slowly, which kept the meatloaf from drying out even when it was reheated the next day. And it was always reheated the next day, sliced cold and laid between 2 pieces of white bread with yellow mustard, which was its own perfect meal. A cup of rolled oats in 1972 cost less than 4 cents. The oats extended a 1-pound meatloaf into something that fed 8 the first night and provided sandwiches for 4 the next day. 12 servings from 1 pound of beef and 4 cents of oats. The science behind this was documented by food researchers at Cornell University in the late 1970s. Rolled oats in meatloaf increased moisture retention by nearly 30% compared to breadcrumb extended versions. The grandmothers who had been using oats since the 1930s didn't need Cornell to tell them. They already knew. They knew things about the behavior of ingredients under heat that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 8. Texas hash. Ground beef. Long grain white rice, uncooked. 1 can of diced tomatoes, 1 green bell pepper diced, 1 large onion diced, chili powder, salt, black pepper. Everything into a covered skillet over low heat for 30 minutes until the rice absorbed the tomato liquid and the beef fat and turned red gold and separate grained and fragrant. It had nothing to do with Texas specifically. It was a name that working-class cooks attached to a skillet dish that required no oven, no multiple pots, no particular skill beyond patience. 1 pan, 1 burner, 30 minutes. The bell pepper cost almost nothing when the garden was running. The tomatoes were a 15-cent can. The rice was pennies. 1 pound of beef distributed through that skillet fed 8 people easily. Each serving had meat in it, had the starch, had the vegetable, had the fat. It was nutritionally complete in a way that the name suggested nothing about. There was no recipe card. It was assembled by instinct, adjusted by smell, finished when the rice looked right. The women who made it couldn't always tell you the exact quantities. They just knew. That kind of knowing is not a lesser form of knowledge. That is the highest form of knowledge, when the skill has moved past measurement and into the body. Number 7. Beef and potato soup. This was not thin soup. This is the first thing to understand. This was a meal, dense and heavy and deeply savory, that happened to be served in a bowl. Ground beef browned first, the fat left in the pot. Onion and garlic softened in that fat. Then potatoes, russets, cubed rough, not peeled because the skin held nutrients and nobody had time for peeling, and enough water or broth to cover. Low heat, an hour, sometimes more. The potatoes broke down at the edges and thickened the broth. The beef fat rose and was stirred back in. A handful of parsley at the end if the garden had any. On the Great Plains, in western Kansas, in the Nebraska Sandhills, in the farming communities of eastern Colorado, this was February food, January food. The kind of soup that made sense of a cold that came through the walls of a farmhouse that wasn't insulated the way houses are now. You ate it and it stayed with you. Russet potatoes cost 11 cents a pound in 1973. A 5-pound bag fed the whole pot and cost 55 cents. Combined with 1 pound of ground beef at 89 cents, the whole pot, feeding 10, came in under $2. It took 3 hours if you let it go the way it wanted to go. 3 hours was not too long. 3 hours was the point. The patience was part of what went into the bowl. Number 6. Stuffed bell peppers, 1 green bell pepper per person. Filled with a mixture of ground beef, cooked white rice, diced tomato, onion, and enough seasoning to make it smell like something worth eating. Arranged upright in a baking dish, a spoonful of tomato sauce over each one, and baked until the pepper went soft, and the filling crust caught on the edges, and the sauce reduced down dark around the bases. The rice inside did what rice always did in these recipes. It absorbed the beef fat and the tomato and doubled the filling. Each pepper was its own complete meal. 1 pound of beef, mixed with rice, filled 10 peppers without stretching. Italian bistros in Chicago and Boston and New York now list stuffed peppers at $14 each on their dinner menus. The recipe is substantially unchanged from what was made in working-class Italian-American kitchens in Chicago's Bridgeport neighborhood in 1974. The price is 1,400% of what it cost to make then. The presentation is the same. The portion is smaller. Number 5. Beef and dried bean soup. The beans went in water the night before. That was where the recipe started, not at the stove, but the evening before, with a pound of dried navy beans, or pinto beans, or Great Northerns dropped into a bowl of cold water and left to soak overnight on the counter. That overnight soak required something that most modern convenience cooking does not require: the decision to make dinner tomorrow while you're cleaning up from tonight. It required thinking a day ahead, planning, the kind of quiet domestic foresight that never got called intelligence but absolutely was. The next day, the beans went into a pot with the browned ground beef, diced onion, a ham hock if there was one, tomatoes, broth, and whatever herbs lived in the cabinet. Low heat for 2 hours. By the time it was done, the beans had absorbed everything in the pot, and the broth had thickened to something that coated the back of a spoon. A pound of dried navy beans in 1972 cost 29 cents. 29 cents. Combined with 1 pound of ground beef, that pot fed a family of 10 for 2 full days. 40 cents per day to feed 10 people. This was not poverty food. This was a system. A complete, intelligent, nutritionally dense system built around patience and foresight and the knowledge that dried beans and ground beef together contain every essential amino acid the human body requires. The grandmothers who made this soup didn't know the phrase complete protein. They just knew their families didn't get sick. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 4. Homemade beef pierogi. The dough was flour, eggs, sour cream, and a pinch of salt. It came together in 10 minutes and rested while the filling was prepared. The filling was ground beef, not much, half a pound at most, cooked with onion and black pepper, and sometimes a little sharp cheddar folded in at the end to bind it. The dough was rolled thin and cut into circles, each one filled with a small spoonful of beef, folded over and pinched closed with a fork. 40 pierogi from half a pound of beef. 40. They were boiled first until they floated, then pan-fried in butter until the skin blistered and went golden, and the outside cracked when you bit into it. In the Polish and Ukrainian communities of western Pennsylvania, in the mill towns of Aliquippa and Bethlehem and Scranton, pierogi were made in large batches on Saturday afternoons. Multiple generations around the table, the grandmother forming the circles, the children pressing the edges, the mother managing the pot and the pan simultaneously. You can buy frozen pierogi now at 12 for $5. They are a reasonable product. They taste like the memory of the idea of what pierogi should be. The homemade version has a dough that yields differently under your teeth, a filling that tastes like the specific hands that seasoned it, a fried exterior that no commercial freezing process has ever replicated. The recipe wasn't lost because it was hard. It was lost because it required an afternoon and a table full of people working together. We stopped having those afternoons. The frozen bag filled the space where the afternoon used to be. Number 3. Poor man's beef stew. There was no chuck roast. There was no stew beef, no expensive braising cut, none of the things that stew recipes assume you have. There was 1 pound of ground beef, and the knowledge that flour-dredged ground beef, rolled into rough balls and browned hard on all sides in a hot Dutch oven, behaved in long cooking the way stew beef behaved. It held together. It developed a crust. It released gelatin into the broth and made it thick. This was not a lesser stew. This is the important thing to understand. This was a different intelligence applied to the same desire, the desire for something deep flavored and rich that had been cooking all afternoon, that smelled like winter, that filled a bowl and then filled you. Carrots, potatoes, onion, a bay leaf, black pepper, beef broth from a bone or a can, and those rough beef balls browned and simmering for 2 hours until they were tender all the way through, and the broth around them had turned the color of dark mahogany. In working-class homes across the Northeast and Midwest, this was the Sunday dinner that the family waited for all morning. It smelled like it had always been there. It tasted like it had always been there. The ground beef inside it had no reason to apologize for not being chuck roast. It was doing something chuck roast could not do. It was feeding 10 people on 1 pound of meat, and it was doing it without anyone at the table feeling the absence of anything at all. Number 2. Stuffed zucchini. In Italian-American households in New Jersey, Connecticut, and the neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, summer meant zucchini. The garden produced more than could be eaten fresh. The large ones, the ones that had grown past the point of tenderness that were too seedy to sauté, those were the ones that got stuffed. The zucchini was halved lengthwise. The seedy interior was scooped out and chopped and mixed with ground beef, garlic, onion, breadcrumbs, a handful of grated Romano, a pinch of dried oregano. Everything mixed together, pressed back into the zucchini shells, topped with a spoonful of tomato sauce, and baked until the shell went tender and the filling browned on top, and the smell of oregano and beef fat and cheese moved through the whole house. In July and August, the zucchini was free. It came from the garden without being asked. The beef was the only cost. 1 pound of beef stuffed 8 zucchini halves and fed the whole table. This is what the garden was for. Not decoration, not hobby, not the kind of raised bed situation that gets photographed for social media. The garden was a food system. It produced vessels. The kitchen filled them. Nothing was purchased that could be grown. Nothing was wasted that could be used. The zucchini that was too big to eat became the container that made the beef go further. That integration, garden and kitchen as one continuous system, is what we lost. Not the recipe, the whole philosophy underneath it. Number 1. Open-faced ground beef and gravy on white bread. 2 slices of white bread laid flat on a plate. Ground beef browned with onion, pulled back with flour and beef broth into a thick, dark gravy. Ladled over the bread until the bread absorbed it and went soft underneath, and the gravy pooled in the plate around the edges. That was it. That was the whole dish. In diners from Minnesota to Mississippi, this appeared on lunch menus through the 1970s as the hot beef sandwich, the cheapest thing on the menu, usually under $1, usually the thing the man who'd been on his feet since 5 in the morning ordered, because it was the most food for the least money, and he had 6 hours of work left, and he needed something that would stay with him. At home it was the meal that appeared at the end of a week, when the money had run out before the week had, when there was a pound of beef left and a loaf of bread and not much else, when dinner had to be assembled from what remained rather than purchased from what was needed. There is a version of this dish on the menu of a restaurant in Minneapolis right now, 2024, called Open-Faced Braised Beef on House-Made Sourdough with Bone Broth Reduction for $26. The principle is identical. The ingredients are more expensive. The technique is the same. The gravy is the same. The bread is the same. The only thing that changed is that somebody decided it was worth $26 when it came from a restaurant kitchen and called it something different. Grandma just called it supper. She put it on the table at 6 o'clock, and everyone sat down and nobody said a word about what it cost or what it wasn't. It was hot, and it was filling, and it was made by someone who had thought about feeding you since morning. That is not a poor meal. That is love translated directly into food, with nothing in between, with no translation lost. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Closing 25 recipes, 1 pound of meat, 10 people at the table. Think about that for a moment, not as a historical curiosity, not as a testament to hard times. Think about it as evidence of a specific kind of intelligence, a mathematical, sensory, practical intelligence that lived in kitchens and was practiced daily and was passed from hand to hand across generations, and was then, in the space of roughly 1 decade, deliberately and systematically dismantled by companies that needed you to buy something instead of know something. The woman who made the oatmeal meatloaf knew what oats do to moisture under heat. The woman who made the dirty rice knew what chicken livers bring to a dish that ground beef alone cannot. The woman who soaked the beans the night before was practicing a form of advance planning, a form of daily intelligence that required no cookbook and left no record. Hamburger Helper took the math away. Manwich took the taste away. Campbell's took the roux away. They didn't do it by force. They did it by advertising, by making knowledge feel like labor, by making scratch cooking feel like sacrifice, by making the women who did it feel like they were behind the times, doing it the hard way, in need of rescue. They were not behind the times. They were ahead of it. They were doing something that nutrition science would spend the following decades trying to quantify, and corporate food culture would spend the following decades trying to sell back to us at $14 a plate and $26 a sandwich. That is not progress. That is the longest con in American food history. So here is the challenge. Not to go back, not to pretend the 1970s were better in every way, but to take one recipe from this list, just one, and make it this week the beef and cabbage skillet, the oatmeal meatloaf, the open-faced gravy sandwich, the beef and bean chili from scratch, with the cumin toasted alone in the pan before anything else goes in. Make it once. Pay attention to what happens. Pay attention to what it costs and what it tastes like and what the kitchen smells like while it's cooking. Pay attention to what it feels like to feed people from knowledge rather than from a box. She knew how to do this. She did it every day. She fed 10 people on 1 pound of meat, and nobody left the table hungry, and nobody called it genius, because genius was just what Tuesday looked like. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.